And Wajahat, you'll also have to start the webinar.
Redirecting to YouTube. And we are
And Wajahat, you'll
live.
also have to start the webinar.
Redirecting to YouTube. And we are go.
Okay, so you started the webinar?
I did.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Mehlaka Samdani. I am with the Community Alliance for Peace and Justice, an advocacy group that seeks to improve U.S. foreign policy towards Pakistan and Palestine. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today on U.S.-Pakistan relations. As the U.S. deepens its strategic partnership with Pakistan, many questions arise about implications for South Asia's stability, the democratic aspirations of the Pakistani people, and the role of the Pakistani American diaspora in shaping U.S. policy. To address these questions and to help us explore various dimensions of the evolving U.S. Pakistan relationship, we are honored to have an exceptional panel join us today. First, we have Dr. Seher Khan, who is an independent analyst and an expert on U.S. grand strategy, non-proliferation and arms control, nuclear security, crisis management, and South Asian regional politics. She has served as the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the South Asia Program at the Stimson Center 2023 to 2025, Research Fellow in the Defense and Foreign Policy Studies Department at the Cato Institute, and Managing Editor of Instinct Media. She has a PhD in political science from the University of California, Irvine, a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, and a BA from Ohio Wesleyan University. Next, we have Wajahat Khan, an Emmy-nominated journalist and best-selling author specializing in South Asia's AFPAC theater of conflict, focused on the Indo-Pacific's politics, conflict, tech, and business. Currently, he is founder and CEO of the Ivy Future of Pakistan Conference, the largest and first of its kind platform to discover and debate the future of the Pakistani American diaspora. A senior fellow at Washington's Atlantic Council, Khan has reported from 16 countries. He was previously bureau chief for NBC News in Kabul and Islamabad, embedded with over 100 NATO, Afghan, Indian, and Pakistani military and paramilitary units. Last but not least, we have Eric Sperling. He is the Executive Director of Just Foreign Policy and a former senior advisor to members of Congress, including Ro Khanna and John Conyers. He has worked for over a decade to strengthen congressional oversight of U.S. foreign policy, leading initiatives to limit unauthorized military interventions, promote diplomatic solutions, reduce the use of economic sanctions that harm civilians, and oppose U.S. support for harmful foreign regimes. He holds a JD from Georgetown University Law Center and a BA from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
So before we begin, I just would like to go over the format of today's discussion. For the first 45 to 50 minutes, I'm going to ask our panelists a series of questions, after which we will open it up for audience Q&A. I would request our audience to please submit your questions in the Q&A function, and we will try and get to as many as possible. And so now, without further ado, I'm going to now begin the discussion. So Seher, again, thank you so much for being here. I would like to sort of start off with this new phenomenon that we're seeing. During the second Trump administration, U.S.-Pakistan relations have unexpectedly warmed significantly, right? Marked by increased cooperation around counterterrorism, cryptocurrency, critical minerals, and claims of Pakistan's massive oil reserves. There's also been a high-profile White House lunch between Donald Trump and Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir. How do you interpret this sudden strengthening of U.S.-Pakistan ties? Are these developments, do you think, are they linked to the corresponding strained U.S.-India relationship, which has also taken a sharp downturn recently, and which is another reversal of decades of U.S. policy towards India? How do you see this dynamic?
Well, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And that's a great question. I think the strengthening of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship during this second Trump administration, especially alongside a cooling in U.S.-India relation, reflects a significant recalibration of regional strategy. And this is driven by a mix of tactical realignment, economic opportunism, and strategic counterbalancing.
Mhm.
Now, on counterterrorism itself, the renewed US-Pakistan cooperation suggests that Washington sees Pakistan, and particularly its military establishment under Field Marshal Asim Munir, as a useful partner in stabilizing Afghanistan and curbing regional extremism. It could be that Pakistan may be offering intelligence, access, or kinetic support in areas where the U.S. has limited reach post its withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. The military to military link, as you've also stated, is this high profile lunch that Field Marshal had with the president in June. It signals a strategic pivot to some extent, but really it really shows that Pakistan and that the United States is more focused on working with Pakistan through its military establishment. And it has always considered the military establishment as the center of power in Pakistan. I don't think it's any secret that the US has always had a soft spot for Pakistan's military leaders. And so I don't think that that in of itself is new in this sort of, recalibration. In terms of cryptocurrency and critical minerals, US interest in these two areas, it signals an effort to secure alternative tech and resource partners outside of Chinese dominated supply chains. And it also, it also makes me think about, the US India relationship as well and the cooling of it and what impact it might have. Pakistan has large amounts of lithium, copper, and rare earths, which make it an attractive alternative, but of course, somewhat a political risky alternative. I will say, though, that the claims of massive oil reserves, this might be overstated and speculative, but it shows another dimension of how the United States is trying to diversify its energy alternatives. And the thing about India, anytime you think about Pakistan, I think for many, you always think about India. And there's this uh, concept that somehow if US-Pakistan relations are doing well, US-India relations must not be doing well. And I would urge all of you to sort of go beyond that black and white thinking. Not everything that US-Pakistan does in its bilateral relationship is a reflection of what's going on in the India relationship. Um, but I do think that, I think the current downturn in the US-India relationship has created diplomatic space for Washington to rejuvenate its bilateral relationship with Pakistan. And I think it's important to also think about the three factors that are impacting the US-India relationship, right? Which have really not much to do with Pakistan. I mean, the
Mhm.
first reason why India and the US are sort of um, having issues, right, is because of India's protectionist trade policies. So India has maintained high tariffs on US goods, especially tech, agriculture, medical devices, etc. And US firms, tech firms especially, have objected to India's data localization and digital services taxes, etc. So this has been a core issue when it
Mhm.
comes to trade. Of course, India's continued arms and energy deals with Russia is a point of contention. And then the third, I would say, is India's foreign policy itself, but
Mhm.
India's foreign policy and its desire to maintain strategic autonomy. All of these three factors, none of them include Pakistan. But of course, this is an opportunity for Pakistan to sort of get back into Washington, and also to some extent dehyphenate. And we've been seeing a lot of discussion rehyphenation again after what happened in May. And sort of my final point on China, of course, China is always a factor in US-Pakistan relations, whether or not people want that to be the case. Pakistan, I think, especially I think it's clear that it has relied very heavily on China for military equipment. Between 2020 to 2024, Pakistan imported an estimated $5.28 billion in arms from China, which constituted 63% of China's global arms exports during the same period. And key acquisitions include fighter jets like the JF-17 and the J-10C, conventional submarines like the Yuan class, frigates, and advanced air defense systems as well. And of course, for the United States, US, non-proliferation and nuclear risks are always front of mind, and
Mhm.
they always look at, China-Pakistan nuclear cooperation, whatever it might entail, as a proliferation risks. So basically, in a nutshell, and I know I've spoken a lot, but in a nutshell, in my view, the warming of U.S.-Pakistan relations during Trump's second term is number one, part of a larger realignment and not a simple zero-sum swap. Number
Mhm.
two, it's driven by tactical needs, terrorism, access to resources, regional leverage, and strategic maneuvering, basically balancing China and managing India. And the third is it's facilitated by shifting global fault lines, where the US is now willing to work pragmatically with imperfect partners.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. I do want to sort of talk about China a little bit because of these sort of warming relations between Pakistan and the US. How is that perceived from China's perspective? Like, how does it see that? Does it see that as a threat? There's also been some discussion among, policy wonks about that there is the Trump administration in its second term has sort of moved away from great power competition to great power cooperation. And so it sees these multipolar sort of, focal points, like Russia is one, China is another. And so rather than competing in a zero-sum game, like you mentioned, it's more going to look for areas of influence that these three large powers can now maintain. And in that respect, perhaps Pakistan might play a more beneficial role because of its close partnership with China and can, in fact, become an arena where this cooperation between Pakistan and China can increase. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Look, I think Pakistan, it's an important country and it is strategically located as well.
Mhm.
So I do think you're correct in saying that, whether or not the Trump administration is focusing on great power politics or not, I think is kind of beside the point, right? US priorities, even before the Trump administration, was always China,
Yeah.
countering China, balancing China, except fill the blank China, right?
Mhm.
And where Pakistan comes into that, I think is relatively new, and a lot of this is tied to what happened in May. Now, before, of course, India has had its relationship with the US, so has China, so has Pakistan. But what happened between India and Pakistan in May, I think, is really telling because what it really showcased
Mhm.
was the use of Chinese weaponry and military equipment really effectively. I mean, the Pakistani Air Force, especially, um, you know, had some wins to its side, and I think that has actually created more tension in Washington, and suddenly Pakistan is back on the map. Now, it's very unclear. The Trump administration is also unpredictable.
Yeah.
So it's very unclear. One day, it could be that Pakistan is considered, an ally, a partner of sorts, and the next day something could happen, and suddenly they're not. I think Pakistan is being very careful, as it should be, and Pakistan is a small country, right? It's a mighty one, but it's a small country, and it's finding itself as balancing between the U.S., China, and to some extent Russia as well. So I think the thing to note is that at least in Washington now, there's more of a desire to cooperate with Pakistan because it's fueled by this thinking that if the US cooperates with Pakistan, it will be less aligned with Beijing. It can bring Islamabad back to Washington's side. But of
Mhm.
course, these things are never simple. And most of foreign policy is almost always transactional, at least from my point of view. So it just depends on what Islamabad can offer Washington, and to some extent, vice versa as well.
Great, excellent. Thank you. We'll come back to some of those questions later on in the program. So, Vajahat, let me turn to you next. While it is true that Pakistan's army chief, Asim Munir, has forged closer ties with Donald Trump, the fact remains that Pakistan's military leadership and the regime that it currently backs enjoys absolutely no legitimacy inside Pakistan. The current civilian government came through fraudulent elections, widely believed to be manipulated by the military, as it has done in previous decades as well. Pakistan's most popular leader, former Prime Minister Imran Khan, and hundreds of political workers and pro-democracy activists continue to be incarcerated by this regime. At the same time, two-thirds of Pakistan's population is under 30. They have democratic aspirations and are very aware of the Pakistani military's leadership's rather pernicious role in subverting the democratic process over the decades and its involvement in gross human rights violations. So, how will the Trump administration's very explicit support of Asim Munir impact US Pakistan relations in the long term, do you think?
Thank you, Malika. And thanks again for inviting all of us. I must also praise you. You gave our lengthy introductions, but I must also confess that you've been a leader in the community here, and your organization has been doing wonderful work, brave work, critical work going forward. And I'm quite excited to actually, at the end of the show, perhaps discuss what CAPJ has been doing and wants to do with the ongoing legislative process to actually target that very illegitimacy which Pakistan's government at this point stems from. It's really interesting, like we've been talking, there's a word which people have been throwing around for the last few years about Pakistan. It's called a poly crisis, right? Now, a poly crisis is multiple crises together. And some genius has come up with this word. And it fits perfectly well for Pakistan. There's a climate crisis, which we are literally living through right now, the worst floods in decades. And we keep on saying the worst floods in decades after every 2 years. So it's escalating. Then, of course, is the political crisis that you've referred to, where it's not just hundreds of people who have been incarcerated, but some are missing, some are gone, some are abducted, some are feared killed by the powers that be over there. Then, of course, is the economic crisis, which is off and on and off and on. And there's a week passes where Moody's ups Pakistan's rating, and then a day passes where Fitch downs Pakistan's rating. So it's sort of like still on life support, especially from the IMF and other institutions. So economically, still sort of trying to stabilize rudder. And then, of course, overall, there's the institutional crises, which we see literally in a whack-a-mole position every day. There's the judiciary, which sometimes tries to do what it can. Just earlier this week, one of the courts in the country, the Islamabad High Court, has risen in open revolt against the higher judiciary, which seems to be completely under control of the army. And that brings us to the big crisis, the security crisis, which seems to be now ongoing. Pakistan has now officially the longest running insurgency of South Asia, which is the Baloch insurgency. Combine that with the Taliban insurgency or the Islamist insurgency, which is on the western borders. The southwest and northwest borders are now running maybe 2.5 insurgencies if you throw in ISIS in there as well, besides the regular Taliban-linked Islamists and the more secular Baloch. So thus, the one-word rule, the one-phrase rule for this, a 90-second polycrisis is polycrisis, right? Now, that's internally, but externally, Pakistan seems to have managed itself well through this regime. They've managed to circle their wagons with the Americans, as has been laid out by you and Sahar in the beginning. They're doing a pretty good job in taking advantage of the Trump administration and its shifting focus or its shifting priorities. India is a net security provider. China is a peer competitor. A different approach to talking to Iran. A different approach to even dealing with the Taliban regime. So they've done a pretty good job there, and they were doing a pretty good job with their other allies, the Arabs, who don't really care much, the GCC patrons like Saudi and the UAE, who don't really care much about the state of human rights or fundamental rights in Pakistan. And then, of course, the biggest benefactor, donor, ally, China, which obviously does not care much and prefers a single window operation of stability, which the Pakistani military is happy to provide them. Now, in the middle of all of this are people like you, are people like me, are people like Sahar, are people like Eric Sperling. And us, through our words, our thoughts, our writings, our activism, our reporting, we do what we can to get the word across. Now, unfortunately, the word hasn't been getting across. And the Pakistanis continue to derive from the benefits of the legitimacy that is granted by even a rack of lamb and jambalaya lunch, which was served, halal, by the way, by Donald Trump to Asim Munir. Now, Donald Trump broke all protocol, broke all propriety, broke all diplomatic normalcy to serve that rack of lamb and jambalaya to Asim Munir. Why? Because Asim Munir will get done what Donald Trump wants. Now, Sahar did a pretty good job in explaining what the Americans want. We've had different spates of what the Americans want. In the 50s and 60s, it was a little airbase in the Northwest to check in on the Russians. In the 80s, it was more than an airbase. It was a whole jihadist platform to infiltrate Afghanistan and take on the Red Army. In the 2000s, it was frankly it was bounty hunting, getting all those Al-Qaeda number ones, number twos, and number threes. The number ones the Americans claim for themselves with Osama, but it was those number twos and number threes which Pakistan literally swept up by the dozens and delivered. And now, what do they want? Now they want what can be called the 3 or 4 C's on from Pakistan. Critical minerals, which is the new black. Everybody's all about them. The Americans want in before the Chinese get in, and Pakistan has perfected the art of staying in both these boats, in the Sino-American boat. Pakistan is one of the few countries which has gotten away with healthy relationships with both Washington and Beijing, and is very proud and vocal and about saying that we're one of the few countries which have done that. So there's critical minerals, it's cryptocurrency, which is a brilliant move if you're a Machiavellian strategist in General Headquarters in Rawalpindi. Just 18 months ago, Pakistan was disallowing cryptocurrency. The state bank governor there, the regulators there were refusing to actually accept that cryptocurrency should be in this country. This is not too long ago. I'm not talking about like 3 years, 2 years, 5 years back. This is just months back. But when they realized that Donald Trump's family empire is connected to a certain crypto firm, boom, all of a sudden they have a crypto czar and they're getting with it. So the Pakistanis have been much more tactically savvy versus the Indians on really, really getting ready to embrace and get embraced by the Trump machine. The Indians have been more clunky, more chunky, more bureaucratic, more stuck with their ways. And frankly, a little bit of flattery always goes a long way. And the Pakistanis have done that, have done well there as well with the Nobel Peace Prize nomination for Donald Trump. So right now, a lot of what the Pakistanis have gained legitimacy-wise has been basically about massaging the Trump administration, literally as far as his ego is concerned, and figuratively as far as giving them what they want. But this, as Sahar had also mentioned, this becomes a really short-term gain. The crypto C, the critical mineral C is followed up by counterterrorism, the other C, and CT is something they do pretty well. They have they do know how to soldier, these guys. Let's just be honest. Sure, they might be making everything from cereals to roads and running everything from banks to amusement parks. They do that well, but they have a pretty good, as Muhammad Hanif wrote the other day, they have a pretty good side hustling and soldiering. And we saw that with India. And they have emerged.
But Wajahat, soldiering externally with India, if they had been good around counterterrorism within Pakistan's borders, we would not have had the insurgencies that are raging right now. 45% militancy has gone on.
Soldiering externally and soldiering internally are very good. There's a big differential there. They've done a pretty good job in soldiering externally. They punched above their weight when it comes to India. A military more than twice their size, a budget more than 8 times their size. They did pretty well. Internally, of course, soldiering doesn't really count much because the insurgencies which are raging, as any student of insurgency would know, you need local support. You need the men, women, and children there to put up their hand and say, that's where the terrorists are hiding. That's where the bad guys are. That's where the IED is hidden. That's where the networks are coming from. And they don't have that local support from the Baloch and Pashtun elements in the country. And that brings us back to the internal polycrisis. So what I want you guys to really imagine is that there's a ball with a very hard shell, which is coated with American legitimacy, Chinese sponsorship, Arab largesse, and it looks really solid from the outside. But internally, Pakistan is still weak. There's havoc, there's chaos, there's instability, and it's just a bit of a mess internally as well. And that's why people like you and I, and other free minds and academics, journalists, etc., are not allowed to fully function, operate, or say their mind there.
Sure.
And that's the sort of a sphere I want you to imagine: a nice, solid, hard coating from all these external sponsors, but
Right.
really a bit of a disaster internally.
And I think what you just mentioned as well a little while earlier, Vajahat, in terms of various US administrations supporting various military dictators because of the geopolitics of the at the time. This time, though, I mean, first we had, of course, supporting the US administration supporting General Ziaul Haq because of the Soviet occupation, then supporting Musharraf because of the US war on terror. But this time, this very explicit support of General Asim Munir comes at a time when Pakistan is completely different. Pakistan is currently going through a very different moment, which it wasn't during those earlier dictatorships, right? The people are so aware of their rights. They've become so awakened to the military's excesses. And I think for the US to not factor that in its analysis, whether it's cryptocurrency or security cooperation, to be forging relations with a military dictator that who lies atop this very inflammable situation within is going to cost the US-Pakistan relationship in the long run. And we can come back to that a little bit as well. But so I feel like that is something that is not factored
Yeah.
into the
Yeah,
analysis.
I think that's brilliant, right? So if you really go back, and we're going to keep this short, but it is worth comparing the last three dictatorships that you've named.
Mhm.
So when Ziaul Haq was given the right deal by the Americans, he had just replaced a populist, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And
Right.
the Americans couldn't care less because
Mhm.
well, even though Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had been judicially executed,
Mhm.
aka hung by Zia and his proxy courts, there was a war going on, and Zia needed to get that support. He got that support. But Pakistan didn't march against Zia. Um, in the 2000s, Musharraf had also replaced another leader,
Mhm.
Nawaz Sharif. Pakistanis didn't march against Musharraf for bringing Nawaz Sharif back. But
Mhm.
this time, it's different because the Americans need yet another dictator, if you want to call him that, Asim Munir, who's replaced Imran Khan. But
Mhm.
people are marching for Imran Khan. Now, that's a very different internal dynamic. The country wasn't going ballistic for Bhutto. It's
Right.
still, it's a lot of people still miss him, but the country wasn't up in arms. There wasn't a protest every 6 weeks or 6 months. Uh, Same for Nawaz. Nobody missed him. In fact, when he was replaced, people were distributing mithai in the streets
Mhm.
of Lahore. Those
Right.
visuals are still recorded and documented on television. But why for Imran? And that begs the larger question. What does Imran have? Is it his 72-year-old good looks? Clearly not. There has to be more. And what is it? Or has Pakistan reached a boiling point through
Yeah.
these smaller, more ethnic, more diverse issues? The Baloch issue, the Pashtun issue, the Siraiki issue, the gender gap, distribution, the army's overreach, controlling everything, economic elite capture. What is it? Is it a bunch of things that over the last 4 decades, people are seeing Imran as the guy who will not go away and stand against the system? Perhaps. And that is something I feel like our friends in the administration are not reading well.
Right.
They
Right. And I
met,
will
they
come
met,
to,
they
yeah.
met Bhutto. They read Bhutto well. Bhutto's
Yes.
come. Bhutto's gone. They read
Mhm.
Nawaz well. He's in exile. Nobody's reading the Imran Khan phenomena well because it's not just
Absolutely.
about Khan. It's about the larger scheme where Pakistanis find themselves. And I hope they do read that well because that's not going to go away anytime soon.
Absolutely. And of course, we can also talk about the role of social media and how that has fueled the Imran Khan phenomenon as well. So we'll come back to that. But I now want to turn to Eric. Eric, thank you so much for being here. You've been a very keen observer of the Pakistani American diaspora. And given your congressional expertise, you have also been a real resource to diaspora community members. So, over the past 3 years, you have really seen up close how the diaspora has actively pushed for human rights and democratic reforms in US-Pakistan policy through congressional engagement, letters, we've had resolutions, there's been proposed legislation. Most recently, Diaspora Advocacy led to two National Defense Authorization Act amendments conditioning Pakistan's military aid on its human rights record. So as an outsider who is looking into this Pakistani diaspora dynamic, what impact do you think these efforts have had on shaping US policy? And how would you address skeptics who argue that such congressional advocacy is absolutely futile given the Trump administration's close ties with Field Marshal Asim Munir?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So yeah, I think, definitely as an observer, but I think it's certainly true that there are essentially two periods in U.S. engagement towards Pakistan. There was the first, 65 plus years, and then we have the period of the last 2 years. And I think, the diaspora has really done something unprecedented, which is put Pakistan's human rights and democratic record on the agenda in Washington. So there's that before period and there's the after period, which is now. And I think everyone in the space is adjusting to that new reality that it's no longer going to be how it was before, where for whatever reason, Pakistan, human rights and democracy was not a consideration. They were largely considered previously, of course, it's just strategic. It was obviously many of us grew up, in the post 9/11 period. It's a focus on terrorism. That was the primary lens it was seen through. I mean, when I was a child, I think many people my age, we remember the Musharraf kind of media blitz. This is something that Americans who knew nothing about Pakistan, somehow we all knew about General Musharraf. So there was, even Jon Stewart has retold this story of his interview he did recently. And it just is amazing to think that that was once how it was. I mean, that will never happen again, where a general leading the government will come here and be treated as if this is some liberal democratic leader. That'll never happen again, and I think everyone is still adjusting to that. So through that consistent engagement you mentioned, starting with the education, the meetings, the briefings, the receptions with members of Congress, that's led to, at this point, hundreds of members of Congress supporting letters or amendments or even an unprecedented floor vote. So the diaspora has really led, really guided by, of course, the work done on the ground in Pakistan by human rights activists. Congress can really no longer claim to be unaware of that democratic human rights record and the role of U.S. policy. So that visibility shift alone is historic. And similarly, just back, like I said, it was always just a focus on Pakistan's role as a security partner, and you'd never really focus on the military's role in the U.S. context, repressing people. Now that's commonplace, in fact, almost common knowledge. I think across both parties, that's really understood that the military is not just an ally; it is also, a very troubled partner that is committing these human rights abuses, and that has it's changed the boundaries of the debate. And then, of course, it's also been impressive and pretty rare how bipartisan it's been. So that is something that has been a huge success of this movement so far. Republicans and Democrats, there's been support on both sides, leadership from both sides. And when there is opposition, it's often quiet. They're saying, they're kind of whispering, well, this is more complex, but, our opponents are often afraid to come out and say their position because they know that their constituents will say, well, are you saying you don't care about my family's human rights or you don't care about our democracy? And it's not a position that members of Congress are very comfortable advocating for publicly. So that's really impressive. Or, for example, they don't just say, oh, well, we'll vote against your proposal. They actually have to work to prevent it from getting to a vote because they know that, of the people who care about this issue, the constituents who care are all on one side, which is they want democracy and human rights to be respected. So, that bipartisan discomfort is signaling that, backing this authoritarian rule is far from a safe or consensus position. So, and even when, there is an immediate success, of course, I think it's sending signals to the regime in Islamabad that their actions are being watched. That shapes their behavior. It's obviously, not as glorious as, a democratic revolution where there's accountability and the human rights violators are driven from power immediately, but they know that they're being monitored, and that is shaping their behavior, and that is and then also we see, for example, they're having to offer very desperate explanations to the United States. For example, we see them, obviously everyone knows that they have hired a lobby firm for millions of dollars. That's going to be a pretty good sign that they're concerned about the congressional advocacy work of the diaspora, using their own taxpayer dollars kind of illegitimately for that purpose, and then floating promises to the Trump administration that are just not very serious, like such as untapped oil reserves that no company has previously thought were really profitable in the current situation, and making increasingly desperate claims to secure that ongoing support. And so, or another example, the regime spokespeople and mouthpieces have attacked human rights supporting Congress members as being Jewish or pro-Israel. And then the regime has also said to the Trump administration, well, we might be open to normalizing with Israel. So the fact that they're taking opposite positions and saying really anything they can to just buy more time, that's just such a dead giveaway that they are incredibly nervous about how they can sustain the U.S. support they need. So, for those who are skeptical of it, I think, because of they say Trump is close with Asim Munir. Trump hasn't even, to my knowledge, has not shown that he knows that person's name. He has not said that person's name in public. I think anyone who knows anything about Trump knows that's not going to be a deep bond. It's going to be, at best, a transactional bond that is largely resulting from their very, unachievable promises. So that can shift quickly. Congressional pressure will strengthen allies inside the administration, which we know we do have. Some degree of allies in the administration who want to take a different approach. But more broadly, no serious actor here dismisses Congress. Whether you want to cut support for this regime or whether you want to keep that support flowing, everybody in the space is engaging with Congress. The regime's ambassadors meeting with members, trying to, slow the pressure and shape that. So the idea that the advocacy doesn't matter isn't a genuine position. It could reflect people's personal burnout, that they might not have the time in their own lives to do that. And that's, of course, understandable. Not everyone is going to have time for that. But people should avoid discouraging others from doing that, just because if they don't have the time or they find it too emotionally taxing, that, we don't want to be discouraging people from this work. I mean, throughout history, it's always the executive branch that's going to be propping up a regime. Initially that's, what, for lack of a better term, could be the deep state or the national security establishment that is going to be prioritizing some sort of big picture that they see, whether it's supporting the South African apartheid regime or regimes in Central America that were, mass killing indigenous people, or any of these regimes. Executive branch is always going to be the source of support, and the opposition is always going to start in Congress. And so, it's just always worked that way. So the idea that the executive branch supporting a regime means we shouldn't push for Congress is the exact opposite. It's not a position that anyone holds on any side of the issue. So and then more importantly, administrations do come and go, but this groundwork in Congress built on the work of constituents. We've already had members of Congress leave and new members come in, and that's work that's done in that district and in Congress lives on. So, I think obviously we're all working towards, ending the human rights abuses and the U.S. support for it as quickly as possible. But it's also important to remember that, we want to build a movement that whatever happens is going to last. It's going to outlast any one administration, and is going to ensure a healthy U.S.-Pakistan relationship that is not supporting authoritarianism, but that is conducive to democracy and human rights going forward, no matter what happens in the next months or years.
Great, thank you so much. And really quickly, Eric, before last year's presidential election here in the US, there were some diaspora organizations, not ours, but there were others who had endorsed Trump for president, right? And they did so with the hope that perhaps he would, utilize all diplomatic tools at his disposal to call for the release of Imran Khan and other political prisoners. Now, when he did come into power, the exact opposite has happened. But do you think that there is some room, there are people within the administration who are working on Trump himself or are sort of working on trying to get Imran Khan released? I know a lot of people have that question.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a possibility. We know very well there are allies in there, but I think relying on Trump can make decisions at a whim, and I think everyone who it unfortunately is a serious thing to try to do to hope that he makes an arbitrary decision that is good. I think everyone is hoping wherever there's a possibility, it's something that you do consider, but that should never take the place. That's of building a movement that has power and that's mature. When you look at obviously the most mature advocacy movement in the United States, which is obviously the pro-Israel lobby, they don't wait to see, oh, is he going to make the right decision or isn't he? Right? They do the groundwork so that they're prepared for any circumstance. And it doesn't mean they don't make direct appeals to him. It doesn't mean, but it does mean that they, that you need to build a movement that can be prepared for any eventuality. And so that's, I think, what hopefully now movement is very young, but I think, I think we hope to see, and we can talk more about it, the movement mature to that next stage of, how to really be prepared, how to have all the pieces in place so that you are a real force to contend with and you can shape outcomes rather than just respond to them.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for that. Guys, we're going to begin the next round of questions. And if I could request you to be slightly more brief in this round, so because we do want to leave some time for audience Q&A as well. So, Sarah, I'm just going to shift gears just a little bit and now focus on counterterrorism. But before I do that, at some point, I would want you to sort of also respond to this notion of this new moment in Pakistan. And while Eric talked about both sides of the aisle in Congress, sort of, coming up to speed about human rights violations in Pakistan, I feel that the think tank world here in the US hasn't really caught up to that reality and doesn't really factor that into their analysis. But we can come back to that later. But now let's just focus on counterterrorism because there has been a lot of ratcheted up cooperation around that between the US and Pakistan, with the US, recently designating the Baloch Liberation Army a foreign terrorist organization, also referencing the Tehrik-e-Taliban and Islamic State Khorasan in the statement following a joint counterterrorism strategic dialogue that took place in August. So I'm wondering what will be the regional implications of this alignment of interests? Are we likely to see more joint military operations along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border? What impact will they have on existing tensions with Afghanistan? Also in Balochistan, if there is more intelligence cooperation in Balochistan against the Baloch Liberation Army, how will Iran view greater US activity, even if they're not physically there? There's sort of more intelligence sharing, intelligence cooperation so close to its border. And basically, I mean, will greater US presence or activity fuel regional instability, or do you believe this will actually reduce militancy in these regions?
No, that's a great question. And so I'll start with Afghanistan first. I mean, I think, the US-Pakistan convergence around threats like the Pakistani Taliban and Islamic State Khorasan, both of which operate from Afghan soil, it puts pressure on the Taliban. It puts greater scrutiny on the Taliban, and essentially it makes the case for Pakistan, right? Pakistan has been since the US withdrew from Afghanistan, Pakistan has been calling on on Taliban leaders to basically curb their sponsorship of the Pakistani Taliban. So I think this renewed cooperation on counterterrorism, especially along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, sort of makes the case for Pakistan. Now, that said, I mean, I think the Taliban should be nervous about more activity along the border. I don't think ever that there will be any U.S. troops. There's no appetite for that in the United States, and Trump certainly doesn't want that either. Um, but I do think that, this sort of renewed cooperation may end up looking like the U.S. supporting or tolerating Pakistani cross-border operations, and maybe even increasing its own over-the-horizon strikes that target Islamic State Khorasan and potentially the Pakistani Taliban assets as well. On the Iran side, I think greater U.S. Pakistan cooperation definitely has Iran nervous. I mean, as we know, Pakistan and Iran share about a 900-kilometer border, and the Balochistan region has been volatile for several decades now, as Wajahat pointed out. And it's something, last January, in January of 2024, we saw some kinetic activity between Iran and Pakistan, and this was all tied to Balochi separatist groups and insurgents there. So I think in terms of Iran, right? In the grand scheme of U.S. foreign policy priorities, Iran, I would say, is like number three. Number one is China. Number two is Ukraine, Russia. And number three is Iran, right? So Iran certainly is more skeptical of whatever the Trump administration does. And it might view cooperation with Pakistan as a way for the United States to further contain Iran. And I think that this will put more pressure on Pakistan-Iran relations as well. It's something that definitely that I'm watching very closely. But in terms of counterterrorism, look, I mean, this is a road that the US and Pakistan have traveled before. This is a well-known road, unlike the cryptocurrency and critical minerals and everything else. I mean, so this is almost feels like deja vu, frankly. At least for me, it feels like I'm back in 2002, and talking about, Pakistan counterterrorism. And Pakistan has, like many countries, Pakistan copied the United States in terms of its own counterterrorism framework and counterterrorism bureaucracy. So Pakistan has NACTA, which is the National Counterterrorism
Counterterrorism
Bureau.
authority. Yeah.
Exactly. And it has, on the civilian side, it has like a parallel judicial system, which is the anti-terrorism courts. It has a host of laws that deal with terrorism. There's the Anti-Terrorism Act, or the ATA, but there's also the Pakistan Protection Act, or POPA. There are various other laws, all sorts of bureaucracy, in line with counterterrorism, framed as something that's an internal threat or a domestic threat to Pakistan. So Pakistan, I think, looking to the US for more cooperation on counterterrorism is sort of a logical thing for Pakistan to do. What that will look like, I think, depends on how strong the BLA ends up being and how strong the Pakistani Taliban ends up being. I think the difference this time around is the strength of the BLA, the Balochistan Liberation Army, and its ability to really do damaging attacks, attacks that have gotten a great deal of attention and that have also claimed at this point, I would say hundreds of lives in Pakistan. And so this is new, and I think it's a little more unclear, like how cooperation with the United States benefits the United States. I don't think it's as simple as having to do with China. And also, Reuters just reported, I think actually today or maybe yesterday, that China is urging Pakistan to essentially reduce this threat of the BLA, right? Like figure this out because it is harming Chinese projects and the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So I think the US cooperation on the counterterrorism side, what happens in Balochistan will be something that I'm definitely keeping a close watch on.
Right. And that might actually engender some cooperation between between the US and China, or at least overlapping interests there, right? Because I think they're both sort of upset with a BLA operation, sort of targeting Chinese engineers as well. And I think there's been
Mhm.
some
And
problems.
and just to add, I just want to say on a basic level, right? Any counterterrorism cooperation almost always has to do more with strategic interest and very, very little to do with human rights. And sort of letting go of repression in any way.
Of
So
course.
I think this is sort of the balance that we're dealing with in US-Pakistan relations. If we're seeing more cooperation on the counterterrorism side, then I do think that we're going to see a lot more human rights violations, a lot more political prisoners, a lot more innocent people being killed who are labeled as militants without any evidence of that. So this is sort of, I would say, the seesaw of cooperation. So more counterterrorism cooperation does not mean more accountability for human rights.
Oh, exactly the opposite. And in fact, like, the last time the US and Pakistan were sort of, fighting together in this US war on terror, 70,000 Pakistanis were killed. And, if we don't even mention all of the enforced disappearances and people who were sold to CIA black sites. So all of that went hand in hand with increased cooperation. And that is my next question to Wajahat. So Wajahat, yes, Pakistani military operations in KPK and this brutal practice of enforced disappearances in Balochistan have already caused considerable and very deep resentment and discontent in these provinces against the Pakistani military, right? So do you believe, as Seher alluded to, that joint US-Pakistan cooperation on counterterrorism operations will intensify these human rights violations and further silence the already marginalized voices of groups like the Baloch Yakjehti Committee, a movement, also the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement? Could these developments then fuel, I mean, not only just undermine human rights, but also fuel further internal unrest in Pakistan?
So the current spate of cooperation, of possible counterterrorism cooperation between the US and Pakistan is heading in a direction which is definitely going to backfire for Washington. Consider, and this is an argument which is not just mine, but it's now picking up, especially across the defense community in Pakistan as well. Now, the anti-Americanism which we saw during the last time these guys cooperated, during the Musharraf and the Kayani era, was reflected well in people who said this is not our war, right? This is America's war and we're doing America's bidding, and 80,000 Pakistanis have been killed by these generals and American drones and the bad guys themselves. And that's an old argument. That's a decade and a half old argument. But 9/11 had happened. American national security was threatened. America followed that up, not just in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also other countries in the region. And the rest is history. This time, the Americans are all of a sudden interested in Balochistan. And just a couple of weeks ago, not too long ago, the Americans were nice enough to actually give a big shout out to the Majid Brigade and the Baloch Liberation Army. Now, the Baloch have never threatened American interests. And by the way, when I say shout out, I'm being sarcastic. The Majid Brigade and the BLA, people who didn't get that joke, have now been designated as officially by the State Department and these great United States as global terrorists. They are designated terrorists, right? That means they're wanted and are at war with America. Now, why is America at war with the Majid Brigade and the BLA? I thought the Majid Brigade wanted to break away from the Pakistani military, or I thought the BLA just wanted to target Pakistani frontier corpsmen in the hinterlands of Balochistan, right? Well, because Balochistan is the key word there, and Balochistan, according to reports, according to the wire, Balochistan is where a lot of those critical minerals, which Donald Trump keeps on tweeting about, right? And every analyst in Bloomberg is excited about, are lying. Also in the KPK. So all of a sudden, the Pakistanis have gotten the Americans interested in what lies beneath the grounds, the sands of this huge underdeveloped province. And that is where all of a sudden the Baloch insurgency has the potential to become anti-American. Now, the Americans should really learn from the Chinese experience, because the Chinese came to Balochistan about 10 years ago in earnest with their CPEC project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is about around 11 years old this year. But the Chinese came in with the same hoo-ha, the same pomp that, oh, we're going to develop Balochistan. with the Pakistani military. But what the Pakistani military did, instead of developing Balochistan, is strong arm the local population, move it around, commander a lot of land and resources, not give much back, not create much jobs, but rather try to pipeline a straight connection between Rawalpindi and Beijing. That saw a decade's worth of the insurgency's processes target Chinese engineers, Chinese personnel, and all of a sudden, a very healthy relationship which the Pakistani state has enjoyed with China became toxic, at least in those circles. Today, if you're Chinese, you're not safe in Pakistan. This is a gift of the Pakistani military to its Chinese friends. This was not always the case. I've grown up eating at Chinese restaurants in Karachi. Those restaurants are gone. And the ones which are around now have guarded policemen outside protecting those Chinese businesses. You can't get an egg roll without going through a security check in my hometown. And that is the gift which the Pakistani military is likely to give the Americans as well, especially if they are the conduit, the middleman of securing these investments. Now, it's totally okay for the Americans to be interested in Pakistan's critical minerals. If they want to come in, they want to invest, fantastic, thank you, we appreciate it. There's huge Canadian firms. This is, by the way, not just Americans. There's huge Canadian firms. There's huge international mining firms which are interested in getting all the G7 economies involved to fund and mine in Pakistan. Thank you. Thank you for your interest in finally coming. And I'm, by the way, from Balochistan. I'd love for that region to be developed, but not at the expense of what is going to happen to the local populations. And that is why we keep on coming back to the involvement of the people. Just yesterday, this happened just yesterday, the Baloch National Party, which is possibly the largest, most organized political party there, which represents Baloch interests, and the PK-MAP, the Pakhtunkhwa Milli Awami Party, which is also a Balochistan-based party, but a Pashtun party. They had a joint speech, they had a joint campaign rally yesterday. Both the leaders, Sardar Akhtar Mangal and Mahmood Khan Achakzai, were present. Both made very, very vociferous anti-military, anti-establishment speeches. Guess what happened? Minutes after their speeches, there was a suicide bombing. Both survived, thank God, but 15 people of their parties were killed. Guess what? On top of that, nobody claimed responsibility. And guess what? What happened after that? Within minutes, the responsibility was pinned, blamed on the Pakistani military. And that is the operational environment in which America is now trying to get into, in which Barrick and other firms are now trying to get into. It's difficult, it's scary, and unless the rights of the people are secured and local leadership is brought on board, this is going to look like one of those Avatar movies where an exploitative colonial entity is going ahead and raping the resources of a local entity, and there's going to be unending crises. But the Americans must learn from the Chinese example on their experience in just the last decade. And just giving a heads up to our friends here in Washington for that one.
No, that's very important. And let's hope that they learn their lessons, which they haven't in the past, but there's always hope. Thank you so much for that, Wajahat. I'm just going to ask Eric, just this last question before we open it up to audience Q&A. I think we have a lot of questions from the audience. So Eric, really briefly, what strategies can the Pakistani American diaspora employ at this time to sustain momentum that we've talked about and drive meaningful U.S. policy shifts, especially at a time, again, because of these strengthened U.S.-Pakistan military ties, but also when the Pakistani government itself is spending, money, like multi-million-dollar lobbying efforts to counter the advocacy that is happening here. Like, what gives you hope at this time that the Pakistani diaspora can sort of pursue? Like, what are strategies, what are ideas that they can pursue at this time?
And I'll just be super brief because I know I think probably over time. But the basic thing is the transition that I described, which is kind of transitioning from that educational stage, and building relationship stage to having a little bit more of a sophisticated understanding of kind of what will really change policy, what will really put pressure on The key focus is, the U.S. has to stop giving the blank check to that regime, whether it's by allowing the regime. Everyone knows the regime has corrupt business ties. That's not really debated at all. But yet they can store all their wealth in Western banks, and there's no sanctions applied, even though sanctions are applied to much less repressive regimes, officials. Making clear to members of Congress, allowing them to store that money is complicity in the kind of harms that are happening to our families back home. Similar with the military aid. If you're continuing to support that regime while they're doing this actions, that is complicity in harming our families. So, moving from they've met with us stage, they're meeting with us. Members of Congress are very happy to give a meeting with virtually anyone. But now transitioning to, we need to see that you genuinely care. And if you genuinely care, you'll end this blank check. You'll impose the very reasonable sanctions on that corrupt wealth. You will put conditions on the military aid, and that's what a true friend will do. And so I think that's the transition that we're hoping the community will make sooner or later to really hold their elected officials to a standard that will actually get the job done and put that pressure on to help end U.S. complicity in these unfortunate widespread human rights violations.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. I think we should end this first part of the discussion on that hopeful note. And so, guys, let's just turn to some of the questions that we have. And let me see. We'll take as many as we can. So one audience member has asked, and I'll sort of put both of her questions together. What concrete steps should Washington take to ensure its aid does not enable repression or undermine democracy in Pakistan? And how can international human rights frameworks be effectively invoked in diaspora advocacy to put pressure on policymakers in DC? Eric, do you want to take that? And then whoever else wants to build on that?
Yeah, I'll be super brief, but we have a great opportunity to do this coming up. The co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission has an amendment to the defense bill that would simply say that Pakistan has to take meaningful steps on ending arbitrary detentions of democracy activists. It's a very low bar, meaningful steps. The administration would just determine that they've taken meaningful steps. So this would be a very easy, low-hanging fruit. And so right now, this is the focus of, I think, everyone in the community is trying to get this to a vote in Congress, where Congress would vote and say, we do want U.S. training for Pakistan's military regime to be conditioned at a minimum on meaningful steps. But that is the broader framework of what you could do generally. Washington talks a lot about human rights. There's going to be very few members of Congress who would pretend to not be aware of that. So you simply say, the human rights you've supported in many other contexts. Well, I'm just informing you, my family's being harmed in the same way. And so if you care for your constituents, such as me, we'd ask you to apply the same standard. And that's essentially how it will be invoked. And then members of Congress can say, I do care about your family, but I care more about this geostrategic thing more than your family. Sorry. They're not going to be that inclined to say that. So the more constituents simply raise that, ask their members of Congress to prioritize their families' basic human rights by taking these steps, I think it would that is essentially going to be the path forward.
Sure. Eric, I just do want to quickly sort of follow up because a lot of people who might be watching might not be aware of this amendment, and even more than the amendment, the National Defense Authorization Act. Could you just very briefly tell people what that is, what the timeline is, when we could look for a vote on some of the amendments? I think that would be great, just because people, I don't think are completely
People
aware.
should also follow Melika's Twitter account, which is, in my opinion, one of the best sources for congressional advocacy information in the community. But the National Defense Authorization Act is essentially the Defense Department's policy bill. It's the one must-pass bill in Washington, passes every year. It authorizes $1 trillion in spending this year and has all the policies for the Pentagon. So that's where a lot of this type of, especially with strong military relationships, where a lot of policy can be impacted. these amendments have been proposed. Now Republican leadership will be deciding whether to block this amendment from receiving a vote or whether to simply allow Congress to vote. Of course, it would be ironic if, when advocates are trying to promote democracy in Pakistan, it'd be ironic if House leadership says, we're not going to allow a vote on democracy. That would be ironic. But that's the type of question where people will be able to see, does Republican leadership in the House have any genuine, care for the human rights of these Pakistani Americans and their families or not? And so we'll know by next week. There'll be more updates again on pages like Melika's, but we'll know by next week how they're going to proceed on that, and many of us will be working to encourage them to simply allow the House to vote on that because there shouldn't be a harm in allowing the House to speak on such a basic question as this. So that's the hope.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, for that. Um, Sarah, I did want to just turn to you and sort of go back to the question that we had raised before. You've sort of are perhaps observing the congressional advocacy that is going on. People like, Wajahat, Muid, so many amazing Heather Mehdi, there's so many vloggers who've been amazing journalists who've done so much to raise awareness about human rights violations in Pakistan. There's a lot journalists like Ryan Grimm and The Intercept. They have focused on this issue as well, and some think tanks, very few, who've also tried to bring attention to this. But mainstream think tanks in Washington have really not talked about this issue this time in Pakistan, and as I mentioned, have not really factored that into their analyses. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there is such a sort of blind spot when it comes to that? And how can we change that?
Well, that's a great question. And while I know, especially, Eric's responses have been quite hopeful, and of course, I think there's a lot of movement happening in this area. I think it's safe to say that this particular U.S. administration doesn't really care that much about human rights. And I would say that many U.S. administrations have not.
Mhm.
So the think tanks kind of reflect that, you
Mm,
know.
right.
And there are many there I mean, DC is a city of think tanks, right? There are many who do really good work and credible research and put their findings out there. But, currently right now there really isn't any funding available that focuses on the intersection of human rights and geostrategic interests. And if there isn't money there, then it's very hard to have analysts work on those issues. I also think that some of these issues are sort of well known already, right? I mean, I think I spoke earlier about this the seesaw of counterterrorism, right? Like more counterterrorism cooperation might be good for U.S. Pakistan geostrategic interests on the one-on-one level, but when it comes to human rights activists and human rights advocacy and civil military imbalances and having a judicial system that's independent and making sure military courts don't try civilians and making sure the anti-terrorism laws are actually laws that are supposed to protect civilians against terrorism and not really helping sponsoring militancy. When you have all of those issues on one side, then I don't think that those balance out. So you have to pick and choose in geostrategic interests. And I think the issue right now in Washington, and I know that I'm not alone in saying this, is currently the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, and even now the Trump administration, they have lost their credibility when it comes to human rights because of everything that's happening in Gaza right now, because of US's support of Israel, because of the amount of military assistance that the US has provided Israel for decades, right? Everything didn't just start on October 7, 2023. I think what we are seeing unfolding in real time on our phones of what's happening, the genocide in Gaza that's happening, I think has really ruined the credibility of the United States and all of those people who are working on human rights issues. And I don't think that that can be discounted. So when we talk about human rights in Pakistan and holding the Pakistani military accountable for its various human rights violations, I don't think the Trump administration has any um, has
Moral
any
high ground.
standing
Yeah.
moral high ground. And the US has lost this moral high ground. So we are now operating in a world where the US doesn't have this moral high ground. So where do you take human rights discussions and accountability there? And frankly, and this is going to sound awful, and I'm really sad to say this, but I think in the grand scheme of geopolitics, human rights simply is not a priority. And I
Right.
don't think that you can find anybody who will say that when we talk about US-Pakistan relations, you should talk about the human rights of Balochis. I just don't think that that is a priority, and I don't think any analyst would say that, even if they think that.
And even, I mean, basically what Wajahat said, though, that it is in the US interest to be able to take those legitimate grievances of the Baloch population and the KPK population into account if it needs to pursue these strategies in any sustainable way. Even the Trump administration's interest in cryptocurrency or critical minerals, for them to be able to exploit those resources, even, they need to have some kind of a regulatory framework that is being propounded by a legitimate government, which is not the case. It's literally a boiling pot right now in terms of a 240 million strong population, two-thirds of which is under 30 again, and is, wants democracy. And so if you're trying to pursue, so to be able to frame these issues, geopolitical interests, geostrategic interests within that framework, I think would somehow perhaps make more sense to, again, within even think tanks. I used to work at think tanks as well, the Council on Foreign Relations, CSIS. And I just felt like there was just such a dearth of that information and those discussions. And so we're really counting on people like you, Sahar, to be able to introduce that within your, expertise as well, and sort of bring that to the mainstream, because I think that is super important.
I think it's important to also note that there's a difference between like longer term goals and short term goals, right?
Yeah.
So, well, I think what you and Vajahat are sort of alluding to are sort of the longer term goals, right? Establishing regulatory bodies or having these interests brought to the military, or those who are in power in Pakistan and whatnot. Those are long term goals, right? Those are not necessarily short term goals, and I think we have to be really aware of the reality of the current situation on the ground in the United States and in Pakistan both. And the Trump administration, I'm pretty sure it's safe to say they're not really that concerned about long-term stability. They're more concerned right now with short-term stability and what that means for U.S. interests. So, to the point that is it in U.S.'s interest to bring these issues to Pakistan? I'm not sure that right now it's in the U.S. interest to bring these issues to the Pakistani military, because
Uh,
I I'm not,
Yeah,
this is just my view. I'm not sure
no,
that
no,
it's
absolutely.
yeah,
necessarily
No,
can
this
I?
is
in
great.
their
And I
interest to do
really
so.
want, yeah, no,
Yeah,
this is how I want Wajahat to now respond, please.
yeah. I think that's a great debate, and I think this needs to be followed up because I disagree respectfully. Because okay, let me give you perspective. This happened yesterday. I'm looking at it right now. I'm trying to put it on the chat, on the group chat, but I can't. But this is a statement from the CDA, the Charge d'Affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. It
Mhm.
just came out yesterday. Now she got her. Her name is Natalie Baker, right? The U.S. doesn't have a full-time ambassador there right now, so this woman is in charge. Now this woman, Charge d'Affaires Baker, has delivered remarks at a webinar, much like this one, hosted by the Business Council for International Understanding, the BCIU, about Pakistan. Now, she goes on to firstly say that Pakistan is very important. It's the world's fifth largest economy. Most of the population is under 30. Its GDP is 412 billion. It could go to, which it's currently number 38. In a few years, it could be in the world's top 10. Now, what's happening, ladies and gentlemen, is that the American ambassador, the acting American ambassador in Islamabad, has done a webinar like this one and is encouraging other American businesses to understand Pakistan better and is saying, hey, American businesses, please understand Pakistan better and, in fact, invest in critical minerals, information, communications technology, agriculture, energy, and infrastructure development because Pakistan is so important. Pakistan is so critical and Pakistan has great growth potential. Now, she's being a good diplomat, right? She's being a good friend. She's promoting Pakistan's broken economy and getting American investments. But Sahar, answer this. Wouldn't all those businesses also gain American businesses, American interest here? Nobody else, right? And I'm speaking like a New Yorker. wouldn't all those businesses augur well if they know that they are investing in an economy which can go awry at any minute because of the multiple insurgencies, the instability which is triggered by an acceptance of the military's overreach, the human rights record of that military, and generally the ongoing security problems there. I think the Americans really need to understand one thing. And this is not just for the think tank debate, this is generally. The Pakistani military gets its legitimacy from Washington. I was just rereading Friends Not Masters, which is the book of the first field marshal, the first dictator, written in his heyday. Ayub Khan wrote that in the 60s. Now, I don't know if anybody of you has read that book, but Friends Not Masters was not meant for people like you and me to read, not meant for Pakistanis to read. It was actually a book to be targeted for a Washington market. And it was a book designed to say, hey, we want to be friends, but we don't want you to be masters. We're very good allies. We'll do what you want, but we'll do it at a basis of equality. Now, other military dictators, one just named by Eric Sperling, Musharraf, who appeared and plugged his book at that famous Comedy Central Daily Show episode with Jon Stewart, which Stewart still likes to talk about. Musharraf wrote a similar biography about Pakistan and America working together as well. Pakistani dictators love to woo Washington. This is where they get their legitimacy from. I'm not saying that Washington should go ahead and cut off ties with Pakistan and not get those short-term, medium-term economic gains from Asim Munir. Absolutely. Milk him. Go for it. If you got him on the hook, milk him. But also understand that if you're in Washington right now, if you are in policy circles right now, the right statement, the right lowering of the temperature, the right tweet can go a long way in pushing the right sort of policies in Pakistan. You can have your cake and eat it too, because that's what the Pakistani dictatorship machine gives you, right? So here is if I was an American think tanker or an American policymaker, I would really understand how the Pakistani military works. They want American largesse and American legitimacy. Right now, the Trump administration, with a tweet or two, can start changing things in Islamabad and Rawalpindi. Why won't they do it? That is really short-sighted, especially from an American perspective, and must change.
Very
All
well.
of that aside, that's all good. I will just say that, look, economic stability is very different from human rights accountability. All right. And businesses don't invest, and I'm not a businesswoman, but businesses don't invest in an environment that is focused on human rights. They invest in an environment that provides them
Businesses also don't invest.
return to invest.
Businesses also don't invest in the longest running insurgency in a
Yeah,
subcontinent.
and human rights violations are causing the instability, right?
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
agree with that.
Because
Look, I'm
those
not saying
long-standing
that
grievances
Yeah.
are not being addressed. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that the US shouldn't prioritize human rights. I'm just saying that in Washington, there is no appetite to prioritize human
is
rights. The
why we need
appetite
to
right
link,
now,
but we need to link those two things, which are intricately intertwined. And without one, you will not have the stability you need for your investments, for your exploitation of mineral resources, all of those things. So they're very intricately tied together, and that link needs to be established. And I
right.
think that is where there's a gap. But guys, I really hope that we can take this forward, because this is such a great debate. And thank you to all of you. But I do want to leave Eric with just one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for just staying for another couple of minutes. And Eric, that's just a general concern that people in Pakistan have, right? And also critics of diaspora advocacy efforts. They often assert that congressional letters or legislation that are calling for democratic norms, human rights in Pakistan, all of that is tantamount to calling for US interference in Pakistan, and that undermines Pakistani sovereignty. And so how do you respond to that? Because that is such a common refrain that we get, and I'd love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, well, it's a valid point because, of course, we do have a huge history of the United States intervening, citing human rights precedents, and then doing things that led to the destruction of entire societies that sometimes take generations to recover from those actions. So So I think that is a valid concern. In this particular case, however, of course, the situation is reversed, where we have a regime that, as Wajahat noted, I mean, it derives its legitimacy from that U.S. support. So there's a game being played where they are suddenly, and we've seen this before in Washington, they're saying, well, Pakistan is sovereign. We can't affect their actions. We can't. They'll make their own choice. But it's really, people know that that's not true. They know that, if they were to take minor steps, this regime would collapse immediately. And so I think we do need to be clear that we're talking about ending the blank check for this regime. We're talking about not propping up this regime. It'll be up to the Pakistani people to determine what government they want in the future. But it's our duty as Americans, so the Pakistani people, they should make sure they are guiding their future. That's who needs to guide it. But the American people, we still have a duty to ensure that our government is not trying to determine that future for them. And that is what's happening now. The U.S. is putting its finger on the scale. And many of these U.S. officials would say, they have a view. They say, well, this is just how Pakistan is. It's just always going to be run by a corrupt military dictatorship. That's just how it is there. And, I understand, of course, that's how it's been. But the Pakistani people are saying very clearly that's what they don't want anymore. And so the U.S. now needs to take a step back, reevaluate, and say, is our role essentially imposing this on the Pakistani people? And would ending that support, withdrawing that support, leave the Pakistanis free to choose their own path? And that's what we think is the case, which is, of course, there's no Pakistanis have no human right. The Pakistani regime has no right to receive U.S. taxpayer-funded training. They have no right to store their corrupt wealth in the Western financial system. And so, unfortunately, I think the American people, we need to kind of remove that from the equation and then see what the Pakistani people do with their own democratic sovereignty.
Great. A great note to end on. Thank you so much for that, Eric. Guys, we have reached the end of our program. Thank you all so much. And special thanks to Dr. Seher Khan, Wajahat Saeed Khan, and Eric for your insightful and really thought-provoking contributions to today's discussion. You gave us all so much to think about and really a framework for sort of understanding these very complicated relations, the impact on the region, the impact on the democratic aspirations of the Pakistani people, and also for sort of navigating what diaspora advocacy going forward should look like. So I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you so much for being here. To our audience, thank you for joining us and contributing your questions. We really encourage you to stay engaged with the Community Alliance for Peace and Justice. Please visit our website, ca4pj.org, and please get involved. Let us know if you'd like to be involved with the work that we do. Also sign up for future events and updates. And then we have one last request for our audience and anybody who might be watching. Our organization really offers webinars and educational programming free of charge. It is funded by community members like you. So if you find our programming useful, please do contribute at whichever level you can. Again, thank you all so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. And again, thank you, Malika, for doing this. I'm really, really obliged. In fact, I'm looking forward to seeing you, Sahar, and Eric later this year in Washington at the Georgetown, Pakistan Public Policy Conclave, where all of you are obviously invited and coming, and hopefully much of our viewers as well. So that shameless plug is actually for furthering this debate as well. So thank you again for having me.
No, thank you all so much. Thank you, Wajahat, for that invitation. We'd love to be